The hum of the city buzzed faintly outside as Mary stood by her kitchen window, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee. The early morning light filtered in through the half-drawn blinds, casting long shadows on the floor. Her phone vibrated on the counter, snapping her out of her daze. Who could that be this early? She muttered. She picked up the phone and saw a message from an unknown number. A simple text that read, "Funeral service at St. Augustine's Chapel, 2 p.m. today." Mary frowned, her fingers hovering over the screen. St. Augustine's Chapel? She didn't remember ever hearing about a funeral, let alone knowing anyone who had passed recently. The message had no name, no additional details, just the chapel's name and the time. She hesitated. There was something unsettling about the vagueness of it all. Normally, she'd brush off such an odd message, but a strange sense of obligation settled over her. St. Augustine's. The name rang a faint bell, though she couldn't quite place it. Maybe someone from the past? An old acquaintance? Despite her initial hesitation, Mary found herself drawn to the idea of going. She'd been feeling adrift lately, a kind of disconnection from the world around her, and maybe, she told herself, this would help shake her out of it. Paying her respects to a lost soul, even if it was a stranger, couldn't hurt. By early afternoon, the unsettling feeling had only grown stronger, but she pushed it aside. She pulled on her black coat and headed out the door. The drive to St. Augustine's took her through winding back roads she didn't remember, though the GPS insisted she was on the right track. As the trees blurred by, the sky grew darker, heavy with clouds. A thick fog began to roll in, swallowing the landscape until all she could see was the narrow strip of road in front of her. When she finally arrived, the chapel loomed out of the mist like a ghost from another time. Old, weathered stone and a sagging roof. It looked as though it hadn't seen a proper congregation in years. Mary parked her car and stepped out, the chill in the air biting against her skin. There were only a few cars in the small gravel lot, and none of the other attendees were in sight. A sense of unease crept up her spine, but she shook it off. "You're just overthinking it," she told herself. Pushing open the heavy wooden doors of the chapel, she was greeted by the faint scent of incense and old wood. The dimly lit interior was quiet, save for the soft murmur of voices ahead. Mary's footsteps echoed in the near-empty space as she made her way down the narrow aisle, eyes scanning the rows of pews. There were people here, but not as many as she'd expected. Only a few rows were occupied by mourners, all dressed in black. Their faces were cast in shadow, heads bowed. Something about their stillness was off, but she couldn't quite figure out what. At the front of the chapel, a simple wooden casket rested on a platform, adorned with white lila. No photographs, no nameplates, no indication of who the service was for. It struck her as odd, but she quickly dismissed the thought. She slid into an empty pew at the back and waited. The priest was already standing at the altar, his face obscured by the dim light, but his deep, low voice resonated through the space as he began the service. As the priest spoke, Mary's mind began to wander. Her eyes drifted over the mourners again, but their faces were still hard to make out. She tried to recall if she'd seen anyone familiar, but nothing clicked. They seemed strange, distant, yet something about this whole scene felt oddly familiar, as if she'd been here before, in another life or in a dream. The chapel's cold air seeped into her bones, making her shiver. She glanced down at her hands, realizing she was clutching the edge of the pew harder than necessary. Why was she so on edge? Her mind raced with questions. Why had she come? Who was in that casket? And why couldn't she shake this feeling that something wasn't right? As the priest continued, Mary shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her gaze was drawn back to the casket. There was something about it that pulled at her, like an unsolved puzzle. But what? She leaned forward slightly, her curiosity getting the better of her. She didn't know why, but a part of her felt like this funeral, this moment, wasn't for a stranger after all. Maybe she was here for a reason she didn't understand yet. And with that thought, the unease settled deeper into her bones. The wind whipped at Mary's coat as she stepped out of the car and into the thick, swirling fog. St. Augustine's Chapel rose before her like a forgotten relic, its weathered stone walls half hidden by the mist. She hesitated, taking in the eerie atmosphere. The chapel looked ancient, as though it had been abandoned for years. Yet here it stood, still intact, still hosting the funeral she had come for. She felt a strange pull in her chest, a nagging feeling that told her she was meant to be here. But why? Her mind reeled, searching for any connection to this place, this moment, and the person in that coffin. Nothing made sense. Mary pulled her coat tighter around herself and made her way toward the chapel doors, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the fog. She passed a few scattered cars in the lot, their windows fogged and dark, as if the owners hadn't bothered to lock them before entering. Something about it felt off, like everything around her was part of a faded photograph, details too hazy to make out. She reached the heavy wooden doors and paused, her hand hovering over the tarnished brass handle. A faint sound of chanting reached her ears from within, almost too soft to be real. Her fingers brushed the handle, and a sudden chill ran up her arm. She swallowed her apprehension and pushed the door open. Inside, the chapel was dimly lit by candles, their flickering flames casting long, wavering shadows across the stone walls. The scent of incense was thick in the air, clinging to her lungs. It was colder than she'd expected inside, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. The murmur of soft voices echoed through the chapel, but they were distant, barely audible. The mourners were seated in silence, their heads bowed, hands clasped in prayer. Mary hesitated again, standing just inside the doorway as her eyes swept over them. The faces of the mourners were still difficult to see, obscured by shadows and flickering candlelight. There was something unsettling about their stillness. Too rigid, too quiet. She moved toward an empty pew near the back and slid in. The wood felt cold beneath her, sending a shiver through her body. She tried to settle her mind, but the unease clung to her like a second skin. Why was it so hard to recognize anyone? Were these people from her past? Was it just her imagination playing tricks on her, making everything feel so distant? Mary's eyes drifted toward the casket at the front of the chapel. It was simple, almost plain, with no adornments except for a modest arrangement of white lilies. The sight of it tugged at something deep inside her, something she couldn't explain. She had been to funerals before, but this felt different, personal, yet unplaceable. As the priest stepped to the altar and began the service, his low, monotonous voice filled the chapel. His words were distant, almost drowned out by the sound of Mary's own heartbeat thumping in her ears. She tried to listen, but the more she focused, the more the words seemed to blur together, like a language she didn't quite understand. She stole another glance at the other attendees. None of them had moved, their heads still bowed, their faces concealed in shadow. They seemed disconnected, like figures in a dream. No one so much as glanced in her direction. A prickle of unease crept up her spine. Why wasn't anyone acknowledging her? She shifted in her seat, trying to ignore the strange sense that something was deeply wrong. She wanted to ask someone, anyone, who the deceased was, but her voice felt trapped in her throat. Instead, she focused on the priest, hoping he would offer some clue, some name that would explain why she was here. But no name came. The priest spoke of loss, of grief, and the passage of time, but never mentioned who lay in the casket. No one else seemed to question it. Everyone in the room was frozen in their silent vigil, locked in their own world. Mary's gaze flickered back to the coffin. Something about it gnawed at her, as though it was a key to the answer she couldn't yet see. Her heart raced, confusion battling the growing dread in her chest. What was happening? Why did she feel like she was the only one out of place? Just as the tension within her reached its peak, the faintest flicker of recognition crossed her mind. St. Augustine's Chapel. She'd been here before, years ago, as a child. But for what? And why had she forgotten it until now? Suddenly, a cold realization began to settle in her bones. She wasn't here for someone else. She was here for herself. Mary sat rigid in her seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as the priest's voice droned on in the background. She kept her eyes locked on the casket, the strange sense of recognition gnawing at her insides. The faces of the mourners remained concealed by the dim light, but she could feel their presence. Heavy, distant, and unnervingly familiar. Her gaze shifted uneasily from one figure to the next. Each mourner seemed frozen in place, their heads still bowed, hands unmoving. It was as though time had stopped for them, as though they were trapped in this moment of silent mourning. And yet, none of them seemed aware of her. Mary leaned forward slightly, trying to get a better look at the closest figure seated just a few rows ahead. The faint flicker of the candlelight illuminated their profile for a brief moment, and her breath caught in her throat. She knew that face. It was a woman, her features eerily familiar. Mary blinked, her mind racing to place her. An old friend? A distant relative? But then the memory hit her like a punch to the gut. This woman had died years ago. She was one of Mary's childhood neighbors, a kind older lady who had passed away when Mary was still in her teens. Her chest tightened. That couldn't be right. She shook her head, convincing herself it must have been a trick of the light, but the feeling of dread deepened. She stole another glance, and her stomach twisted in knots. The woman was still there, her face unmistakable, as still as the rest of the mourners. Mary's heart raced as she turned her attention to another figure. This time, a man seated across the aisle. His profile was obscured, but something about him was achingly familiar as well. His posture, the way his head tilted slightly to the side, it reminded her of someone she used to know. She squinted, trying to get a clearer view, and then it hit her. That was Mr. Patterson, her old history teacher, the one who'd passed away nearly a decade ago. Her pulse quickened, panic rising in her throat. How was this possible? She looked around the chapel again, her eyes darting from one mourner to the next. The more she focused, the more familiar the faces became. A former colleague from her first job. A distant cousin she hadn't seen in years. A neighbor from the old apartment complex she'd lived in during her 20s. All of them gone. All of them dead. The air in the chapel seemed to grow colder, the candles flickering weakly as if the very light was struggling to survive. Mary's hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the pew, her mind spinning with confusion and fear. She wanted to leave, to run out of the chapel and never look back, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. She turned her attention back to the priest, who was still speaking in that low, droning voice. But now, his words seemed to carry no meaning, like static filling the air. He hadn't acknowledged her once. In fact, no one had. Not a single glance, not a single nod of recognition. It was as though she didn't exist at all. Mary's breathing quickened as she tried to make sense of it all. These were people from her past, people she'd lost or hadn't thought about in years. How could they all be here, in this forgotten chapel, attending this funeral? Her thoughts spun wildly. The one nagging question rose to the surface. Who was in the coffin? The pull toward the casket grew stronger, an almost magnetic force drawing her attention. She needed to know. She had to see for herself. But fear held her in place. Fear of what she might find if she dared to approach. Her mind raced with possibilities. Could it be someone else she knew? Someone she had lost touch with? Or was it? No, it couldn't be her. The idea seemed absurd, but the unease gnawing at her wouldn't let go. Her gaze drifted back to the mourners, their familiar faces now taking on an eerie, almost ghostly quality. None of them moved. None of them reacted to her presence. The realization hit her slowly, creeping in like a shadow. They weren't here for anyone else. They were here for her. Her breath caught in her throat, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. This funeral wasn't for some stranger. It was for her. And she was the only one who hadn't known it until now. The cold settled deeper into her bones as the gravity of the situation dawned on her. She wasn't a guest at this funeral. She was the deceased. Her heart pounded in her ears as she fought to stay calm. But the room was closing in on her, the mourners' ghostly faces watching her without ever turning their heads. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words died in her throat. Her legs felt like lead, her body frozen with the weight of the truth. In the pit of her stomach, she already knew what she would find if she dared to look inside that casket. Mary's breath came in shallow, uneven gasps as she sat frozen in her pew, her mind spinning with the impossible truth. The dead. She was surrounded by the dead. People she once knew, now long gone, were seated just a few feet away, mourning her. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to steady herself, but the realization wouldn't loosen its grip. It clung to her like a vice, tightening with every passing second. She forced herself to look away from the ghostly mourners, desperate for a distraction, something that would explain it all, anything to make this nightmare vanish. Her eyes drifted toward the front of the chapel again, to the casket that had been calling to her since she'd walked in. The priest was still speaking, his voice now a dull hum in her ears, overshadowed by the frantic pounding of her pulse. Next to the casket, she noticed something she hadn't before. Propped up on a small stand was a framed photograph. A tremor ran through her as she squinted at the picture. She couldn't make out the details from where she sat, but the familiarity of it gnawed at her. She needed to see it up close. Her body felt heavy as she stood, like an invisible force was holding her back. The sound of her shoes on the stone floor echoed through the chapel, but no one so much as turned their head. The mourners remained still, locked in their eternal vigil, their faces still obscured by shadow. She moved cautiously down the aisle, every step toward the casket intensifying the sinking feeling in her gut. Her fingers trembled at her sides as she finally approached the photograph, the candlelight flickering just enough to reveal the image inside the frame. It was her. Mary felt the air rush from her lungs as her knees buckled, and she reached out, steadying herself against the pew nearest the casket. The photograph stared back at her. A younger version of herself, smiling, frozen in time. Her mind raced to process the sight. Her lips quivered, trying to form a word, but no sound came. She touched the frame with shaky fingers, half expecting it to vanish, to be some figment of her imagination. But it was real. The smooth glass was cold under her fingertips, as cold as the fear that gripped her heart. It wasn't a mistake. That was her photo, on display, next to the casket. "This is my funeral," she thought. "This is for me." Her hands flew to her face, trembling with shock. How had she not known? How had she walked in here so oblivious? The memories, the fragments of her life, all came crashing down at once. Moments from her past, her final days, that feeling of letting go. Her mind raced to the last thing she could remember before today. She had been sick, hadn't she? Something vague, something she brushed off as nothing serious. But it had been. She recalled the dizzy spells, the fatigue that had crept into her bones, weighing her down. She had convinced herself it was just stress, but now she knew. Her time had come, and she hadn't even realized it. The priest's voice carried on behind her, but his words barely registered. Mary's focus was solely on the casket now. Her own photo stood beside it, her life laid bare for all to see. She forced herself to move forward, the weight of dread heavy on her chest. She had to know. She had to see what waited inside that wooden box. She reached the edge of the platform, her legs trembling as she leaned over to peer into the casket. And there she was. Her lifeless body lay perfectly still, her hands gently folded across her chest. Her face was pale, serene, as if she had simply fallen asleep and never woken up. But it was undeniably her. A sob choked its way up her throat, but no tears came. Her mind was too overwhelmed to process the flood of emotions that swirled within her. She had been at her own funeral from the beginning, and she hadn't even realized it. The truth settled over her like a shroud. She was dead. Mary staggered back from the casket, her hand covering her mouth as she stared at her own lifeless form. The room around her seemed to close in, the air thick and suffocating. How could this be happening? How could she be here, standing, thinking, feeling, when her body lay cold in that box? Her eyes darted back to the mourners, who still sat in perfect silence. They hadn't moved. They hadn't reacted. Because they were already gone, too. Just like her. She stumbled backward, panic gripping her chest. She wanted to run, to escape this nightmare, but there was nowhere to go. The cold truth was undeniable now. This was her end. The distant toll of the chapel bell echoed through the room, the sound pulling her further from the world of the living. She felt it deep in her bones, a final calling. Mary sank to her knees, her head spinning with the weight of it all. She was no longer part of the living world. Her time had passed. She was just another spirit now, another lost soul lingering in this place between life and death. And soon she would fade, just like the others. Mary knelt in front of her own casket, her mind numb, reeling from the weight of the truth. Her hands trembled against the cold stone floor, her breath shallow as she stared at the lifeless form that lay inside. Her. It was really her in that casket. For a moment, everything seemed to stand still, the reality of it all suffocating her. The chapel around her felt impossibly quiet, the faint flickering of candlelight the only movement in the space. The priest continued to speak, his words barely registering in her mind, a distant murmur drowned out by the pounding of her heartbeat. She had seen the truth. She was dead. The realization settled over her like a heavy fog, wrapping around her mind and body, dragging her deeper into despair. But even as her panic threatened to consume her, a nagging thought surfaced through the haze. The others. The mourners. Mary stood slowly, her legs shaky beneath her. She forced herself to turn back toward the rows of pews, her eyes once again falling on the silent figures seated there. The same stillness, the same rigidness in their posture, and the same vague, ghostly presence that had unsettled her from the start. But now, she knew what she hadn't allowed herself to see before. They were not mourners. They were not here to grieve. They were like her, dead. A shiver ran through her as she took in the eerie sight of the ghostly figures. All of them had faces she recognized. People she had known in life, people she had long forgotten. Her old neighbor, her former teacher, the distant cousin she hadn't spoken to in years. They had been there all along, waiting for her to realize what they already knew. None of them looked at her. None of them moved. It was as though they were trapped in a frozen moment, locked in an eternal state of mourning. But it wasn't just any funeral they were attending. It was her funeral. Mary's heart raced as she pieced it together. These weren't just spirits haunting the chapel. They had been waiting for her to join them. They had been dead for years, lingering in this place between worlds, bound to this final moment of farewell. And now she was one of them. She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her pulse quickening. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, but her voice felt like it had been stolen from her. Fear tightened around her like a vice as she looked back toward the priest. His voice had grown louder, more insistent, but the words still didn't make sense, like a language just beyond her grasp. Desperation clawed at her chest. She took a step forward, her eyes locked on the priest. She needed to know why she was here, why she was trapped in this limbo with the others. Her voice cracked as she finally spoke, her words barely a whisper. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why me? Why am I still here?" The priest paused for the first time, his back still turned to her as he stood at the altar. Slowly, he turned to face her, and as his eyes met hers, a chill ran down her spine. His face, once shadowed, was now fully illuminated by the candlelight, revealing a hollow, sunken expression. No longer human, but something else entirely. His eyes were dark and empty, like black pools of nothingness, and when he spoke, his voice was deeper, almost inhuman. "It is time to accept," he said softly, the words echoing unnaturally in the chapel. "Time to let go." Mary took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. Accept? Accept what? That she was dead? That her life was over? She shook her head, panic rising in her throat. No, she wasn't ready to accept anything. Not yet. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why am I still here?" The priest took a step toward her, his movements slow and deliberate, his dark eyes never leaving hers. "You have not let go," he said, his voice low, almost soothing. "You cling to the life you once had, but it is no longer yours. The time has come to release your hold on the world of the living. You belong with us now." Mary's breath caught in her throat as his words sank in. She was clinging to the past, refusing to let go of her life, her memories. But how could she? How could she just let go of everything she had ever known? The world she had lived in, the people she had loved, the life she had fought so hard to hold on to. It was all slipping away, and she wasn't ready to say goodbye. Her gaze shifted to the casket, her lifeless body lying there, so still, so final. This was her reality now. There was no going back, but accepting it, that was a different kind of death, one she wasn't sure she could face. "I don't want this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I'm not ready." The priest's expression softened, but his eyes remained cold, unyielding. "No one ever is," he said, his voice echoing through the silent chapel. "But death waits for no one. You cannot change what has already come to pass. You must cross over, or you will be lost forever." Mary felt her chest tighten, the weight of his words pressing down on her like a crushing burden. She turned her head toward the ghostly figures in the pews, her eyes scanning their emotionless faces. They had accepted it. They had let go. And now they waited for her to do the same. The coldness in the room deepened, the air growing thick with an unspoken force. She could feel the pull, the invisible hand urging her toward the darkness, toward the acceptance of her fate. Tears welled in her eyes as the finality of it all began to sink in. She wasn't ready, but it didn't matter. Her time had come, and there was no escaping it. The mourners rose from their seats in unison, their ghostly forms flickering in the dim light. They turned toward her, their hollow eyes watching, waiting. They had been through this before. They knew the path she had to walk. And now they waited for her to take the final step. Mary stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as she felt the world shift around her. She was no longer part of the living. This was her fate, and there was no turning back. Mary's breath came in ragged gasps as the mourners stood, their ghostly forms flickering in the dim candlelight. They faced her now, their empty, hollow eyes locked on her, waiting. The air in the chapel grew heavier, thick with expectation. She could feel it, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, demanding her submission. She took a step back, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it, the final moment where she had to accept the truth. But every fiber of her being screamed against it. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to let go of the life she once had. "I can't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I can't let go." The priest stood at the altar, his dark eyes fixed on her with an almost pitying gaze. "You must," he said softly, his voice echoing through the silent chapel. "There is no other way. You cannot remain between worlds forever. To do so is to lose yourself completely. Mary's gaze flickered back to the mourners. Those familiar faces, now twisted into ethereal versions of the people they once were. The truth was undeniable. They were dead. And so was she. Her chest tightened as memories flooded her mind. Flashes of her life, the people she loved, the things she still wanted to do. How could it be over? How could everything she had ever known, ever loved, be gone in the blink of an eye? No, she muttered, shaking her head in defiance. There has to be a way back. There has to be something I can do. The priest stepped forward, his expression unchanged. There is no going back, Mary. What's done is done. His words hung heavy in the air, but Mary refused to accept them. Her heart raced as a surge of desperation washed over her. She turned on her heel, her mind spinning with the impossible thought of escape. There had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do to fight this. Without thinking, she bolted toward the chapel doors, her feet pounding against the stone floor. The flickering candles cast long shadows as she ran, her breath ragged in her ears. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get out. Had to get away from this place and from the truth that haunted her. The doors loomed ahead, their dark wood gleaming in the faint light. Mary's hand reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed the cold brass handle. But just as she gripped the handle, a searing cold shot through her body, stopping her in her tracks. A sharp gasp escaped her lips as she recoiled, her hand yanked back as though burned. The cold seeped into her bones, and she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with shock. The doors wouldn't open. They wouldn't let her leave. No, she cried, her voice echoing off the chapel's stone walls. No, please. Her plea went unanswered. The mourners stood motionless behind her, their ghostly forms flickering like dying flames. And the priest stood at the altar, unmoving, his face expressionless. Mary's breath hitched as the crushing reality set in. There was no escape. The chapel wasn't just a place. It was a threshold, a boundary between worlds. She had crossed it the moment she stepped through those doors. And now, they would not open for her again. The coldness that had gripped her hand spread through her body, chilling her to the core. She staggered back, her legs trembling beneath her, and collapsed into the nearest pew, her heart racing with fear and disbelief. Her mind whirled with fragments of her old life, memories of laughter, of warmth, of everything she had left behind. And now it was all gone. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision as the full weight of her fate crashed down on her. There was no escaping death. There was no escaping this place. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "Why? Why me?" The priest's footsteps echoed softly as he approached her, his dark robes trailing behind him. He stopped just a few feet away, his gaze calm, almost kind. "Because it was your time," he said gently. "You fought to stay in the world of the living, but death claims us all, Mary. Some pass quietly, some fight, but in the end, we all come to this place." Mary's tears spilled over as she looked up at him, her voice trembling. I'm not ready to say goodbye." The priest's face softened, his eyes full of understanding. "None of us ever are, but you must. You cannot linger here, trapped between worlds. It will only consume you." Mary's breath caught in her throat, the weight of his words pressing down on her chest. She knew he was right. She could feel the pull, the invisible force drawing her toward the truth, toward acceptance. But how could she let go? How could she just disappear? "I don't know how," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The priest knelt before her, his dark eyes meeting hers. "You don't need to know how," he said softly. "You only need to accept. The rest will follow." Mary's hands trembled in her lap as she stared into his eyes, her mind swirling with fear and uncertainty. Could she do it? Could she let go of everything she had ever known? Everything she had ever loved? She glanced back at the mourners, their ghostly forms still watching her. They had all made the journey she now faced. They had all let go. The finality of it settled over her, like the quiet after a storm. There was no other choice. She couldn't remain here, trapped in this limbo, forever fighting what she couldn't change. She had to accept it. Taking a deep breath, Mary closed her eyes. The tears that had welled up finally spilled down her cheeks as she whispered the words she had been too afraid to say. "I'm ready." The moment the words left her lips, the cold that had gripped her body began to ease. A strange warmth spread through her, and the weight on her chest lifted as if an invisible burden had been removed. The pull she had been resisting for so long grew stronger, but this time it wasn't terrifying. It was peaceful. She opened her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the mourners clearly. Their faces, once blurred and distant, were now sharp and full of emotion. Peace, understanding, and acceptance. They had all been waiting for her, and now they stood ready to guide her. The priest gave her a small nod, his expression calm. "It's time." Mary rose to her feet, her legs steady beneath her. The fear that had gripped her was gone, replaced by a quiet, peaceful resolve. She took one last look at the chapel, at the mourners, at the casket where her body lay. And then, with a final breath, she stepped forward into the light. As Mary took that first step, everything around her began to shift. The cold, heavy air that had clung to the chapel seemed to lift, replaced by a soft warmth, like the first rays of the sun after a long, dark night. The flickering candles brightened, casting a gentle glow that no longer felt ominous but comforting, like a final embrace. She walked toward the front of the chapel, her footsteps now soundless, weightless. The mourners, once frozen and distant, turned to watch her. Their faces no longer blurred, no longer hollow. They were clear now, each one of them familiar, filled with the serenity of souls who had long ago found peace. Their eyes met hers, and in their gazes, she found something she hadn't expected: acceptance, understanding, and love. Mary's heart no longer raced in panic. The fear, the confusion, the resistance. It was all gone, washed away in this moment of clarity. She felt light, unburdened for the first time since the funeral had begun. The weight she had carried, the denial, the refusal to let go, had dissolved. As she reached the casket, she paused. Her own body lay there, still and serene, a mirror of herself as she once was. But now, it felt distant, as if that version of her belonged to another life entirely. She didn't feel tethered to it anymore. She didn't feel fear when she looked at it, only peace. She turned to face the mourners one last time, her heart swelling with gratitude. They had been here for her, waiting patiently as she came to understand what they already knew. This wasn't a place of sorrow. It was a place of transition, a place where the living came to realize their time had passed. The priest stood at the altar, watching her with that same calm, understanding gaze. His role was clear now. He wasn't just presiding over a funeral. He was guiding her, helping her cross the threshold between the living and the dead. He gave her a small nod, his voice soft and steady. "It's time, Mary." She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth around her grow. The pull toward the light at the edge of her vision grew stronger, but it wasn't frightening anymore. It was inviting, like a familiar friend she hadn't seen in years. With a final glance around the chapel, Mary turned toward the light. The mourners faded gently into the background, their presence still felt but no longer visible. They had done their part. Now, it was her turn to cross over. As she walked, the light enveloped her, a gentle warmth that filled her with a sense of peace she had never known in life. Her body felt lighter, her steps more sure. There was no more fear, no more hesitation, only acceptance. The world around her grew brighter and softer, the lines between the chapel and the light blurring until there was only the light. She could feel it pulling her forward, welcoming her into something greater, something she couldn't fully comprehend but didn't need to. And then she was no longer walking. She was simply there, one with the light, one with everything. The chapel, the mourners, the casket, they all dissolved into the background, as if they had been but a dream. What lay before her now was something beyond time, beyond life or death. It was a place where everything was still, where everything was at peace. For the first time, Mary felt whole. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth wash over her. There was nothing more to fear, nothing more to hold on to. She had crossed over, and in doing so, had found peace. The final tether that had bound her to the world of the living slipped away, leaving her free. As the light enveloped her completely, Mary smiled, feeling a profound sense of release. She had found her way home. And then she was gone. Thank you so much for watching. Your support means the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more gripping tales and deep dives into the mysteries of folklore and the supernatural. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions about the story. Feel free to share them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the unknown.